We've all felt that specific frustration, trying to explain a complex emotion to someone, only to realize the words feel thin and disconnected. You try to build a narrative, but the explanation feels like a hollow substitute for the actual experience. Toph Jackson calls these shapeless shapes, the raw, non-Euclidean realities of our traumas and identities before we attempt to pin them down with language. Now, communication requires us to take that infinite shifting reality and compress it into a crude, static form that fits onto a page or into a conversation. To function in the world or navigate a clinical diagnosis, we have to draw rigid Sharpie lines around those shapeless experiences. Drawing these lines is a practical necessity. You can't draw a shape without a little ink. We need these boundaries to communicate. The trouble begins when we mistake the drawing for the reality. We start believing that these crude, provisional outlines are the definitive edges of who we are. When we forget the line is just a tool, we trap our shifting identities inside a static box of our own making. These lines are often drawn thick as a defense. They act as perimeters intended to protect our internal state from the volatile or unpredictable emotions of the people around us. Sometimes it's a simple social mask, like telling a cashier you're doing fine while collapsing internally. You draw a fake line just to avoid the friction of being seen. Over years, these defensive outlines harden into fawning behaviors or an armor of apathy, where the primary goal is simply keeping the border secure. Eventually, we end up with a load-bearing Sharpie line. A temporary boundary is suddenly functioning as a structural pillar, holding up our entire psychological framework. We take a trauma narrative or a diagnosis and elevate it into an absolute, unchangeable truth, simply because we've leaned on it for so long. Defending these rigid lines creates a psychological border wall, which can end up isolating us from the very world we were trying to navigate. This creates a massive dissonance. Our internal, shapeless shape inevitably grows and moves, but the rigid Sharpie line stays stuck in the past. Maintaining the illusion of control becomes exhausting. We spend our lives trying to force an evolving reality back inside an old, static box. It's like aggressively guarding no trespassing signs in a public forest. You're protecting a border that the landscape itself doesn't recognize. The fortress built to protect our authentic self eventually becomes a prison, blocking out connection and love. We often assume truth is a static perimeter that requires a ruthless defense, but a rigid border cannot keep pace with a shifting internal experience. If the shape of our trauma and identity is always in motion, then truth works less like a fence and more like a compass. It becomes an orientation, a direction we follow to protect our core needs without needing a defensive wall. Security comes from staying loyal to our internal moral foundations, rather than guarding red lines that were only ever intended to be temporary. This is the fundamental split between the map and the territory. The labels, the words, and the Sharpie lines are the map. Our lived, shapeless experience is the territory. Healing sidesteps the search for a perfect, permanent line to draw around ourselves. Instead, peace involves accepting the ambiguity of the shapelessness. You allow the story to become whatever it was intended to be, rather than what the ink says it is. By putting the Sharpie down, the map falls away. You stop defending the borders and finally start living in the territory.